Reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus said to his disciples, "A rich man had a steward who was reported to him for squandering his property. He summoned him and said, 'What is this I hear about you? Prepare a full account of your stewardship, because you can no longer be my steward.' The steward said to himself, 'What shall I do, now that my master is taking the position of steward away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the stewardship, they may welcome me into their homes.' He called in his master's debtors one by one. To the first he said, 'How much do you owe my master?' He replied, 100 measures of olive oil. He said to him, 'Here is your promissory note. Sit down and quickly write one for 50. Then to another the steward said, 'And you, how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 cores of wheat. The steward said to him, 'Here is your promissory note. Write one for 80. And the master commended that dishonest steward for acting prudently. For the children of this world are more prudent in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. I tell you, make friends for yourselves with dishonest wealth, so that when it fails, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. The person who is trustworthy in very small matters is also trustworthy in great ones. And the person who is dishonest in very small matters is also dishonest in great ones. If therefore you are not trustworthy with dishonest wealth, who will trust you with true wealth? If you are not trustworthy with what belongs to another, who will give you what is yours? No servant can serve two masters. He will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon." The Gospel of the Lord. Many financial advisors will advise saving 10 to 15% of your household income for retirement and starting in your 20s. Good luck. So a lot of people have a goal just generally, it doesn't necessarily mean as much as it once did, but a lot of people have a goal to be a millionaire, to have $1 million. And did some calculations. If you start with nothing and save $300 a month and invest at 5% interest, you'll have $1 million in 54 years. Okay, all right. If you start with nothing and you're lucky enough to save $400 a month, invest at 5% interest, you'll have $1 million in 48 years. All right, we got it under 50, that's good. $500 a month at 5% interest will knock it down to 44 years. And if you are so lucky to be able to save $800 a month at 5% interest, you can have $1 million in 36 years. And I'm not sure that this is particularly encouraging information to anyone here. But the good news is that Jesus gives us a bit of investment advice in our gospel passage today. And this passage is admittedly one of the most confusing passages in the Gospels, but it doesn't have to stay that way. In fact, with a bit of awareness about what matters to God, what He finds important, we can see pretty clearly what Jesus is trying to get across. And actually, the church has been very clear in her understanding of this parable and her subsequent teaching. It's preserved clearly in the writings of St. Augustine, and even to an extent in the church's liturgy. St. Augustine lived 1,600 years ago. First of all, what trips up most of us is we don't understand why the master commends the steward for stealing from him. The steward discounts the debt that the people owe the master, so that they'll be motivated to provide for the steward after he's fired from his job. And if we presume that the people had a complete harvest, then they have a spare 50 measures of wheat and 20 measures of oil with which they can provide for the steward. So the discount on the debt is essentially stealing. He's getting what's owed his master. It will come back to him. But that isn't what the master commends the steward for. He's commending him for his prudence, for his foresight. He makes an investment in his future, so that he will be provided for. Now, even with that clearly in mind, the righteous people who would hear Jesus speak this parable probably still don't expect it to apply to them. So when Jesus himself commends that dishonest steward for acting prudently and says that the children of this world are more prudent in dealing with their own generation than the children of light, the people are thrown for a loop, how could he say that that cheating scoundrel of a steward is wiser than I? The thing is, even the unconverted, the non-Christian, invest well in their future well-being, in their earthly future well-being. And what Jesus is implying is that the children of light, particularly Christians, are stewards of the Lord's household. And he's compelling us to use his money. We really only have custody of it. We are to use his money in order to pay down the debts of other people, particularly the poor, that they may welcome us into the halls of heaven, eternal dwelling places. Jesus is putting wealth in perspective. He says, if you can't be trusted with earthly wealth, who will trust you with the wealth of eternity? Using your master's money wisely is really a small matter. And if you can't be trusted with this, how can you be trusted with what truly matters? Now, that understanding of the parable really comes into focus when we take God's word seriously, especially about the poor. In our first reading, we basically hear a list of offenses against the poor that many would commit in the marketplace, cheating them out of just transactions, getting rich on the backs of the poor and the lowly. Now, fixing the scales or selling the junk parts of the wheat may have seemed like a very small matter when the merchants began taking advantage of the poor. But at the end of the reading, God promises never to forget these offenses committed against his lowly and afflicted. See, here's the thing. There is no one who gets a free pass to heaven. And yet when we see how God speaks about the poor throughout the Bible, we can see that if anyone has a leg up on the rest of humanity, it's the poor. There's a tendency to presume that the poor will find a place in heaven before anyone else. And we see in this reading today from the prophet Amos, among other places, Jesus speaks of it in the Beatitudes, in the story of the poor man Lazarus versus the rich man, and when speaking of the final judgment, when the righteous are separated from the wicked. If there is a presumption about who will be in heaven, God himself suggests that they will have been poor. It's fascinating too. I attended a wedding yesterday afternoon, and I mentioned that this idea, this understanding of this parable is inscribed in the church's liturgy. Part of the final blessing over this couple was this: may you be witnesses in the world to God's charity, so that the afflicted and the needy, who have known your kindness, may one day receive you thankfully into the eternal dwelling of God. Even as we bless this married couple as they begin their lives together, there's this presumption of sorts that the poor will be there in heaven waiting to welcome them because they have provided for the poor in their kindness. See, Jesus is really saying to those with money, look, the welcoming party in heaven is led by the poor. And if you're here, if you make it there and be welcomed, you need to imitate the dishonest steward in a spiritual sort of way. You need to take my money and provide for the needs of the poor, and so invest not your earthly future, but your eternal future. I mentioned earlier that the church has always understood this gospel in the same way. And St. Augustine, like I said, 1600 years ago, wrote and explained it like this: why did the Lord set this before us? It's not because that servant cheated, but because he exercised foresight for the future. And when even a cheat is praised for his ingenuity, Christians who make no such provision blush. I mean, this is what he added: behold, the children of this age are more prudent than the children of light. They perpetrate frauds in order to secure their future. In what life, after all, did the steward insure himself like that? He was insuring himself for a life that was going to end. Would you not insure yourself for eternal life? So if there's anything to be learned today from our gospel reading, it's that we need to run out and drain our retirement accounts and spend on the poor. I'm not saying that. Not everyone is called to the same level of radical material giving, but it is easy for us to use that reality as an excuse not to seriously consider the poor, and really not even develop a heart for the poor. Oh, well, I'm not called to give away everything and live like a beggar. And yet it's increasingly clear to me that if somebody made the mistake of giving too much of their livelihood away and became poor themselves for the sake of others, I think Jesus would be showing that person off in heaven. He would be so proud of them for that mistake. Spiritualized understandings of this passage notwithstanding, there is room to speak here about the spiritual goods, using the spiritual goods that God has given us to address the needs of the spiritually poor as an investment in eternal life. Showing that love and wisdom and compassion to those who are in need, in unfortunate situations. But today, Jesus clearly invites us to invest in eternal life by developing a real heart for the poor, the financially poor, the mentally and socially poor. One of the questions, more practical questions that comes up quite often, the reality of needing to grow in freedom to give to the poor is something that's always with us. But another practical question that comes up is just how do you treat the people that you run into on the street who are just flat out asking you for money? I always tell people that in a lot of cases, in most cases in the city and things like that, people know where they can find more systematic help. And so oftentimes they don't necessarily need exactly the money in your pocket. But there is something about our hearts that need to have the freedom to be open to this person who has approached us on the street seeking money from us. And even if it's just to stop and ask them their name and pray a simple prayer with them, even if it's from time to time offering a buck or two or some spare change, just to say, look, I have the freedom to do this for someone. I genuinely care about this poor and needy person. This person who is just experiencing a totally different place in life than I. Those are things that we need to consider, is how is my heart open to this person? In either way, may we invest wisely in our future of eternal life. And may that same blessing of the married couple belong to all of us today. We may truly offer our hearts to the Lord and to the poor. That He may say to us today, may you be witnesses to the world, to God's charity, so that the afflicted and the needy who have known your kindness may one day receive you thankfully into the eternal dwelling of God.